what I found really quickly was that there were not very many deal makers. There were a lot of attorneys. There were a lot of people there to burnish their resumes and move to the next step, but there were not people who were willing to think creatively and take risks. And the same people who bought Alaska, Seward's Folly, 1867, they were not there in 2020 in Washington, D.C., right? Or if they were, it was hard to get things done. Now, what's missing from D.C. is a lot of creativity, new blood, new thinking, a can-do spirit, right? You can't always be taking direction from lawyers because a lot of them are going to circumscribe what you can do. Mm-hmm. You have to figure out a way to do things.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I am the COO of American Moment, and I'm not joined by Saurabh. You can see his vacant chair here. He had an important meeting to go to, so he saddled you with me instead to do the intro and outro. We had a very fascinating guest today, our second ever episode on the Arctic, but before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that American Moment has going on. As always, you can visit our website at americanmoment.org. There you can find information about all of our programs, events we have coming up, what we believe, why we do what we do, a bunch of cool media stories that people keep writing about us for some reason. And you can also find now, I believe by the time this comes out, the application for the first ever Fall Fellowship for American Statecraft. That will be open from, I think it launches on April 1, and it will be open until, I believe, May 2nd is the deal. So if you're looking to get your first start in DC, the fellowship pays $3,000 a month. We get you in a position here in Washington, D.C., and then you do trainings with us all day on Friday, and we do sort of bespoke placement to be able to get you a full-time job at the end of the fall. I got to get used to saying fall. I'm used to it being summer. It's fall. So please go ahead and apply for that. You can always reach out to me if you have any questions, nick@americanmoment.org. And with that, we will get to our exciting guest today. So we had Tom Dans, who is a visiting fellow at the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and noted pecan, right? It was pecans, Matt? Yes. It was pecans, pecan grower. I get all the nuts confused. I'm not really a big nut guy. But we had Tom on to talk about his very insane life story, career, the time he spent in the Soviet Union, the time he spent on Wall Street, his work in the Trump administration at the Department of the Treasury, as well as his time on the the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. We covered stuff like why we don't currently own Greenland, why Greenlanders are not American citizens. We talked about the icebreaker gap, the time that he spent in the Trump administration, and some of the difficulties that were presented by other staff. It was a very, very fascinating episode. Tom, I actually can't believe that we never ran into each other because we were working on this Arctic stuff at the same time. But he is a new friend. We will probably go get dinner after this episode comes out and everything. He's a very cool guy, and you guys are going to be totally blown away by the new most interesting man in DC. We will go now to Tom Dans.
Tom, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Our guests who are watching on YouTube will almost assuredly be very confused. We actually recently had our gala for American Statecraft, and one of our supporters was seated with your brother one night and then you the second night and was very confused. But tell us a little bit about yourself. You're related to our good friend Paul Dans, but tell us how you got here today and the strange path that brought you here.
Sure. Sure. And thanks again. So Paul and I are identical twins. So
Who would have guessed?
Exactly. So he is 6 minutes older than I am. Paul meaning small, Tom meaning twin.
Yeah,
So
there you go.
now he is a little bit bigger than me as we look forward 54 years. So basically, he gave a little bit of background on our story, but we grew up in different places. Young life in Colorado, moved to the DC area in elementary school still. So that was kind of formative years, and then grew up mostly in Baltimore. And then both our professional careers kind of diverged. I went to finance and he went into law, and eventually came around to us both serving the Trump administration.
So tell us a little bit about those years in finance. You've lived all over the world. What journey did you take? We've got some listeners who are in the world of Wall Street, and so many of them, it's like, oh, I'm just going to spend 10 years at Goldman just sitting here in an office. You did not do that.
Sure.
You did something much more interesting.
No, absolutely not. I guess maybe I should just step back and kind of tell you how I got to Wall Street in this case. So it wasn't necessarily by design. It was more by exigency, which is when you go to school and scholarship and debt, and you figure out you're got a liberal arts major, it's time to make some money. Back. And I had, we can get into it a little bit later, but I had Russian growing up as a kid. Went not from Russian extraction, but I went to public school outside Baltimore that had been founded in 1957. So like Sputnik, kind of the first stage of the Cold War space race. And program was to teach Russian to ordinary American kids. So started with that. And literally my parents got tapped to see if your son wanted to try this. We were from immigrant backgrounds, so we're not from money. We on both sides of the family, kind of second generation, third generation Americans. So spoke a lot of different languages at home growing up, but most, we were the first generation raised in English in basically a house with running water. Literally in the Lower East Side, New York is where the family's from. So going to New York for a job other than cleaning restrooms was kind of a new thing for us, but that was what Brown University prepared you for. So I went there in 91 as part of a analyst training program for Merrill Lynch Capital Markets, it was called at the time. Worked the traditional, what they would call in the farm business, dark to dark. So it was 100-hour the work weeks as a analyst, but did that for a period, and then got an opportunity to join a firm called Allen and Company Incorporated, which some people will know. Very well established, small effort merchant bank, started kind of in the early 30s by two brothers that became Wall Street legends. People may know it from the Sun Valley Conference. So they were very successful investments in 200 public and private companies. And I went to work for one of the senior managing directors there. So really had a fantastic introduction into the street. Spent a few years at Allen. My boss was on the board of News Corporation. So this is good, dialing back to when one of my first meetings was when Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation was looking at bankruptcy, and I was sent in to help refinance News Corp there with Goldman bankers and me as a 24-year-old or 23-year-old in the room. So that was, but that flowed on to groups like Saban Entertainment. Haim Saban, people will know, is a big Democratic backer. We actually were very plugged in the Democratic side of things. So I had Governor Clinton coming in the office, and one office on Fifth Avenue and 55th Street, literally in the shade of the Trump Tower. Which was just across the street. So had some early intersection with President Trump at that point. We had represented Paramount on the sale of what was Madison Square Garden at the time. So it was the venue, and then it was the Knicks and the Rangers, and then Miss Universe pageant. Well, he was fixated on Miss Universe pageant. And so we would get a regular call from the Donald every other week wondering if he could just buy the Miss Universe pageant. And the answer was no, get your group together, buy the whole enchilada. So anyway, he ended up with it a few years later, but that's the nature of his character. He's focused on something, he gets it.
Yeah. And somewhere in here, you spent time in the Soviet Union?
Yeah. So,
tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So, growing up, studying Russian, I went to Brown, as I mentioned. That was a opportunity for, full communist indoctrination. We're talking the mid-late 80s is an interesting time. We had people on campus. Amy Carter went there. We had JFK Jr. on campus. Dukakis was running for president. So I went on one date with his daughter. She won't remember that. So there were dalliances on it was one date. It was one day. My wife didn't know about that, but
she does now.
Yeah, she does now. So it was a opportunity to go study abroad in 1990 that brought me to the Soviet Union.
Wow.
And to get credit for it. And so I went over and I studied at a place called the Moscow Energy Institute. It's a little bit in the western part of the or the eastern part of the city, Taganska region. And group of us, about 10 American kids in the program. And we stayed in a dormitory, which was all people that kind of from the outer republics or from the Comecon countries. So we had interesting mix of, we had people from Buryatia, we had people from Chechnya, we had people from Kazakhstan, then we had Cubans. We had very interesting mix of people all in this group there to study Russian, but also to take classes at this Power Engineering Institute. And so this was literally 1990, months after Tiananmen Square. And it was when the first moves for Baltic independence really came on the scene. So it's a fascinating time. We were poor college students in America. We landed in the Soviet Union and got to basically experience life where, $5 would buy you a 5-course meal with vodka, caviar, and the rest. But that was not how we lived every day. More often than not, we were standing in bread lines in empty stores trying to buy oranges or buy things through the black market or basically, and it's hard for people to appreciate who didn't experience the Soviet Union, especially as it was in the stages of collapse at that time. But there were no phones. There were no cars, in a sense. If we wanted to call back to home, you had to go and order a phone call a week in advance. And then you had to show up at the local telegraph and wait for your phone call to be put through, and then you're told to which cabin and which booth you would go to. You'd pick up the phone, you get some crackly message, and then all of a sudden you'd be talking, it was cut off. And that was how you made a phone call. Or there was one fax machine in Moscow. You literally had to go across town to right on what's called Tverskaya. It dead ends right into Red Square right now, Ulitsa Gorkova, at the time, the Central Telegraph office, and ask, has a fax arrived for me? And they would say yes or no, and what's your name? And but it was this type of experience that you can't separate what's going on today with that if you don't have this view in time to really understand how they got to where they came from. And
so you teased this earlier. Fast forward, you spend several years on Wall Street, and then you and your brother sort of reconvene when it comes time to serve President Donald Trump. Tell us the story of why you decided to take that step into public service and why you ended up specifically where you did in the administration.
Sure. Well, I had always had an interest in politics. From a young kid, I like I said, we enjoyed languages. We spoke different ones at home. And I thought, in fact, that I would go into the diplomatic corps right out of school. And it was kind of, for the younger people listening, for me, taking the foreign service exam passing the written part but never making the oral was kind of like the best thing that never happened to me. So like literally I had gotten a strong job in Wall Street with, very good salary out of the box and able to pay my debt back in 2 years. But I was gung-ho. I was ready to go stamp visas in Bujumbura. And then if that, wasn't on the table, like Ouagadougou, send me wherever. I was up for it. And
you could be making up place names right now.
It was that type of thing. And basically what I saw was, hey, just not interested. Thank you for your interest, and we've got it from here. And I said, okay, well, we'll go back and find another route into this thing. So, as I said, I had been at Allen & Company. I'd gone and run a venture fund in Russia, in Moscow there in the mid 90s. If I can come back to that, $440 million fund. So that was interesting. Actually capitalized by the U.S. government at the time, if you can believe it. And then I came back and we started Evercore Partners. So my boss there was one of the founders of Evercore Partners, one of the big bank, modeled on Blackstone at the time. And one of the other partners was Roger Altman, who had been DepSec of the Treasury in Clinton, if you remember the Whitewater imbroglio, and et cetera, et cetera. So I had glimpsed this kind of revolving door of the street and politics, and thought that was very interesting, but I could not abide by the politics. I kept my mouth shut. I said, that's just not who I am, what I stand for necessarily, but still was attracted to it. But this was never coming together. And then, we moved. I was successful enough in my early career that I could kind of go out on my own, which I did. And we moved to Texas. My wife is from there in 2005. And I got pretty far afield. So I was working for different hedge funds, activist strategies. I was kind of call it special operator. So I would just kind of go into deals and find deals and bring them, but I didn't really wear the outward face of being on the street. And I got into the pecan business. So I was really far afield. And then, so when you're on a tractor, I was growing pecans. I was literally, we planted 75,000 trees in Texas. So.
Okay, so Texas pecans are the best pecans, right?
Best pecans in the world. We'll come back to that. You know where the best pecans in the world are from? Actually, Eagle Pass and that part of the country. So we'll come back to that. Yeah. But literally spending a lot of time on tractors, running teams, planting trees, and talking to trees, frustrated, taking in a lot of El Rushbo, and a lot of AM radio, and feeling like, okay. And my wife basically gets tired, so. I put myself in the escalator class, Trump supporter. So as soon as that speech was made, I was like, this is it. I like this disruptor. I like a businessman. I like someone who has a financial grounding here, which was really important. I thought we hadn't seen that before. We had people who played that part, but really didn't understand things. So him coming in, I said, well, I need to help this. And my wife said, well, you better go do it if you're serious, because I don't want to hear you complain about, if you lose. So I took off in October. Kind of, we were going into harvest season, and I basically said, hey, we were at that point, we were marketing to the largest supermarket chain in Texas to us. And you're going to have to cover this season because I'm going Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, because it looks like that's where the action is. If we can make it happen in that part of the state, we have a shot at winning Pennsylvania. We have a shot at going to the dance here. So joined up with a Get Out the Vote group and went there. It's called Mighty American Strike Force. Yeah. Encourage anybody who's so enthused to join up this season. We basically idea is
was this the True Texas Project people like Julie McCarty
Well, that's a little different. Yeah. This is a also Texas group. Yeah. Was called the Mighty Texas Strike Force. Yeah. Kind of came in the early 2000s under Bush 1, and the idea was to send Texans from red states as kind of force multipliers to get out the phone bank and kind of help drive the election. So at this point in time, remember, Pennsylvania was a one-day vote. now it's 75 days, right?
Yeah.
And it was tight but you were able to see, I mean, like once you knock on 1,000 doors and you talk to people, which I did that year, you realize something is major happening here, right? You get out and there is no alternative, I mean, for getting out on the ground and talking to voters, right? If you're going to be in politics, I would say that to everybody. Take the time to go talk to voters and get face to face. Just don't wear a suit like this, but you go around and knock on doors and don't be afraid to talk to the people. And because you'll really be able to divine what's next. So that happened. He won. We, changed the world. And it was a very exciting time.
So how did you go from that to serving in the Trump administration?
Yeah, well, look, coming in from politics, while I had exposure to the machine on the other side, I had no connections on the Republican side. So again, this is talking to anybody who's interested in politics and not connected. Look, that's part of what we're doing with the Trump movement, Project 2025. You all are a big part of it. But we're trying to say, hey, this is accessible for everybody in the movement. If you have conviction, you have a place in this movement. So come, especially young blood, come to DC. We'll help you get plugged in here. It wasn't that way joining the Trump administration, especially if you were coming at it from not within the campaign directly or not from an establishment path. And of course, I had the unfortunate feature of having a Russia background. So ta-da, Russia hoax, which when this came on, I said, no, that just kind of blew my mind that this was going to be a thing. I said, this can't be serious. And they were very serious about it. So, it took several years of knocking on doors and false starts and interviews where I thought I was going to be brought on only to be told, no, somebody blackballed you at Tennessee or I don't know, but you never really know, right? You need that pull from the inside to get into the admin, and that's what I was lacking. But that changed, fortunately. My brother Paul joined. He kind of made it in, and then changes at PPO, which were so important when Johnny McEntee came on and really kind of revitalized the effort there and brought the staffing deal. So the phone started ringing. Hey, are you still interested in coming to work for the government? This was during COVID. And I said, yeah. Hey, just tell me, I'll be there. So I came up in the middle of COVID, and it was like a 5-alarm fire, of course, with the CARES Act, literally putting out, what became trillions of dollars. But we ran the airline rescue program. So it was real trial by fire.
Tell me a little bit. So what month and year did you exactly make it into the administration? So
that would have been 2020, I think probably April.
Okay.
I mean, it was not we were playing for the second half, I'll tell you that much. But hey, I was happy to be here.
Yeah.
And, I came into Treasury.
What position did you come in?
I was, initially they had asked me to be the DAS, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia. And then I got a call saying, hey, would you really consider, we want you to work closely with the secretary and would you be counselor to the undersecretary for international affairs? So technically it's a role of an assistant secretary rank, but you're kind of a minister without portfolio. So I said, hey, I'm a team player, put me where you need me and let's get to work. So I was counselor to the undersecretary for international affairs.
Who was the undersecretary?
Brent McIntosh.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I think would be helpful for our listeners is talking a little bit about how uniquely powerful Treasury was during that COVID era and how much of the administration's response to COVID was being routed through there. Just tell us a little bit about some of the things that the Treasury was up to in those months.
Yeah. Well, this was like all hands on deck emergency where people really didn't know what was ahead of them, right? So it was a little bit of a real-time trial and error, but with a lot of money at the same time and an urgency to get things done. And basically, we were not staffed up to do it. We were very dangerously short of political appointees. We went to a remote working environment. So this is 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue for most people know, but we're right on the grounds of the White House. We're literally a stone's throw from the East Wing. You walk out every day. You're right there, waiting for the first lady to wave you in, come join for dinner. It never happened, but the emphasis there was both you had line responsibilities and you had kind of these exigent needs. So I was kind of thrown onto the CARES Act, implementing the CARES Act. So this was particularly putting money out to not necessarily the commercial airlines because they were handled under a different loan program under the CARES Act, but this was all of the related service providers. But it was both literally
give me examples of service providers.
So if you were an airline maintenance company, if you were a smaller airline, you were getting served through this window, and we were giving basically the payroll support. So, and we were also giving loans. So, but you were going down to very small businesses. Literally, I'd be talking to a guy who was had a single plane in Alaska trying to get money. And, I'd spend time trying to direct him sometimes to an Office Depot so he could fax the document back to the Treasury so we could wire the money out that night. But other times I was calling up people in bigger companies saying, hey, we want to wire you from the U.S. Treasury, $60 million. Can we get your DUNS number, please? I'm calling from the Treasury. This is not a joke. No, you can't call me back because we don't take incoming calls, but you can check your emails to see that this is not a scam.
That's crazy.
So, yeah,
How many people thought it was a scam?
Oh, a lot. You get hung up on. Let me tell you, I'm from the U.S. Treasury. I'm calling because the secretary's asked me to reach out to you. Click. Yeah,
that's funny.
So, no, it was a very interesting time. So if you remember back then, inflation was low. Interest rates were low, right? But spending was high. And, there was an opportunity, kind of a missed opportunity, I would say sometimes for when you're in that moment of just purely focus on execution and you kind of miss the opportunity to do creative things. So we probably had the opportunity then to push out the duration of our debt, now 35 trillion and counting, right? But the idea, you looked at some countries, they started issuing negative interest rate bonds, right? Austria, right? Or they went out really long tenors. We could have done that, right? So, and it may still be something we need to think about in the next administration, right? There is a need for that's one of the themes that I would say to people. What's missing from DC is a lot of creativity, new blood, new thinking, a can-do spirit, right? You can't always be taking direction from lawyers because a lot of them are going to circumscribe what you can do. You have to figure out a way to do things in policy.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting that Andrew Kloster once talked about on our show is that the kinds of people who opt in to go to a department like Treasury are often not the kind of people you want at a department like Treasury. Yes. They're sort of status seeking or upside seeking people financially for after the administration. Can you talk a little bit about the culture war inside Treasury? I mean, I'm sure for every one guy like you, there were two guys like that description.
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, and especially when you're coming from the street. Look, it was a one-way street, literally, no pun intended, to come from, and fortunately, I'd already left Wall Street to Main Street, right? So, but I had friends call me up and say, "You out of your mind? You gonna work for this guy? You never come back to Wall Street." I go, I'm going to hold you to that promise because, look, that is the view. If you
because you work for Trump.
Oh, if you work for Trump, you were going to you had a scarlet letter there. You were not going to go back to the street, let alone at a prestigious position. So it's really like a lack of risk takers. which is kind of unfortunate. And you say, well, you don't want the people gambling with the country's money. But at the same time, these people are not bold enough to take chances when they need to take chances, to trust their instincts, right? That's a key thing, I think, like, especially for our movement, it's courage. You have to believe in yourself, right? We've got a national kind of collapse in our own kind of self-esteem and courage, and we need that more infused through places, even if they seem mundane at Treasury, right? So part of what brought me to Treasury was when President Trump started talking about Greenland, I go, boom, I am in. Look, how did that not happen? When I got to Treasury, I said, let me understand this. So take me through what happened here. And I can't talk about everything because obviously a lot of this got classified and my work got classified after that. But what I found really quickly was that there were not very many deal makers. There were a lot of attorneys. There were a lot of people there to burnish their resumes and move to the next step. But there were not people who were willing to think creatively and take risks. And the same people who bought Alaska, Seward's Folly, 1867, they were not there in 2020 in Washington, D.C., right? Or if they were, it was hard to get things done. Now, I can tell you, we started to move along those lines and we're making great progress. And literally January 6th, I spent most of that day in a skiff at the White House. And we were working on different things, and so there was much underway, and hopefully we'll be back next year. Shortly after the hour of noon on January 20th.
Yeah, the thing I always like to remind people about the Greenland stuff is like Truman tried to do this in 1948. Like it's not even like the first time that we've like attempted to do something like this. It's like
and it was always the framing of it was wrong. It wasn't our framing. It was always purchasing. It was buying. It was not partnering.
Yeah.
It was not born from the reality of our strategic interests and the Greenlanders, frankly. And it was completely bathed in kind of like an acute ignorance, I'd call it, about Greenland, about the strategic posture. Who can tell you there's 50,000 people in Greenland, right? They have and look at the politics within Greenland. Look at the constitution in Denmark, right? Nobody really brought it down to different levels. And frankly, what was the economics drivers behind that? So, there were ways to make a win-win-win deal, I think, between all the parties involved. I still think there are.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. You also spent time as a U.S. Arctic Commissioner at the Arctic Research Commission. How did that happen?
Sure. Yeah, no. So interest in the Arctic, I'd say I hinted it earlier at my family history. So Danes, if people are wondering, we're from the north of Spain. It's a place called Galicia. And they said, well, that name's not Spanish. Well, it's Gallego. But, and Danes, D-A-N-S, if you believe this, is a corruption of Danes. So that area my wife, who is actually German-American, really doesn't like me telling the story, but the Vikings at one point were supposed to have settled in Spain and actually went on to Ireland. Pray, oh God, I'm going way back in history and fables for y'all. But
you're doing the Putin interview right now. You're starting way back.
Exactly. But my family basically, they came to New York basically by the grace of God. My great grandfather came to New York, and the rest of the family that left Galicia, they went to countries like Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, and fortunately my grandfather came to New York. So we were for centuries seafarers. And interesting point of fact, the Gallegos and the Spanish played a key role in the American War. And that's part of history which has kind of been lost for various reasons, but in terms of like financing it and actually supplying the weapons. So it was the Spanish merchant ships that brought the uniforms and weapons to Valley Forge, right? So in some of the darkest moments of the American Revolution, the Gallegos were there. So we kind of have some pride. The rest of the family, my grandmother was from southern Italy, from Basilicata, and the other family's French Canadian, French American. So, but my grandfather, who was kind of a little bit of a street tough, you've heard the expression "shape up and ship out." So, in going back to the early 1900s in New York City in the Battery here, and word was he got in a fight or something, but next thing he was on a tramp steamer shoveling coal, going to Shanghai and Vladivostok as a 14-year-old. So he shipped off to sea at 14 years old, spent his life at sea, actually fought in the Spanish Civil War. It's a whole nother chapter. But when World War II came around, he wanted to join the effort, couldn't do it, but was actually then serving in the U.S. Merchant Marine. So he's a U.S. Merchant Mariner. They call him the first to leave, the last to come home. So this was a group that were brought under military supervision during the war, but were basically civilians held to military standards, but never given recognition as veterans until 1987, if you can believe it. So he made hundreds of trips during his lifetime. He made dozens of trips during the war. He went to Russia several times. He did the Murmansk run, which is kind of very kind of well known. PQ-17 was one of the biggest disasters, I think, in U.S. naval history, where we lost, I think, 22 of 33 ships on that. And he fortunately, by the grace of God, he was a survivor. So he also immediately after war, and this was a connection to Greenland because you asked, he was in something called Operation Blue Jay, which built the Thule Air Force Base. It's now called Bituvik Air Force Base. So as a little kid, it's in Greenland. It's in Northwest Greenland. It was built in 1951 in it was the largest construction project at that point in time in the Arctic. And it was to put a Air Force base there where Russia could be within range of our strategic bombers. So, you grow up. My grandfather didn't have a 8th grade education, but he lived this kind of wild, adventurous life, sailing around the world and doing these great things. And he actually was able to, through his work, become a chief engineer. So he was running, you saw the ship in Baltimore that crashed into the bridge yesterday. My grandfather used to run the engine room in the equivalent of those ships back in the day. They were literally that was the bullseye. If you were in the engine room and you were the chief engineer, you were the bullseye in World War II. Mm-hmm. But it was an incredibly complex job.
When you say that, that's where enemy ships and aircraft would target the missiles, because that's where you blow that up, the whole ship sinks.
Right.
Yeah.
Hit midships, below the waterline. That was the name of the game for a U-boat. And so when I went to Russia, we learned the language, and I said I spent a few years there in the mid-90s running a fund, and we got into doing deals. A lot of it was in oil and gas in the Arctic at the time. So I spent a lot of time traveling around. The fund was managed independently from a group of like Wall Street luminaries, but it was financed 100 cents on the dollar through the U.S. government. It was something under the SEED Act, supporting Eastern European democracy. I think in 1990, Bush won. And it's one of the real success stories because was a direct investing effort meant to put capital to work in the early stages of the transition from a command to a capitalist economy. And we did really well. And we basically, this was, we returned serious multiples on our capital invested. We paid for the fees. The problem was the Treasury had no way to take money back. There was no mechanism to return money to the U.S. Treasury, believe it or not. So the money now sits in like different 501c3s, and it's been repurposed for different, aims, but policy aims. So, that was the kind of the entry into the Arctic, and then the work while at the White House for, both for Alaska, doing a lot of work there, and then in Greenland. So
and do you just in this scenario, do you just go to your boss and say, "Hey, I have a bunch of experience in this," or like how did getting on the commission come about specifically?
Sure. It's I think it's the president hires you. It's a privilege in the outgoing administrations, or typically it's been that way, to do staffing of commissions and boards. And it's recognition for the service that you put forth to the administration, really to the country. Keep in mind this service in government sounds glamorous. I know a lot of your DC listeners are probably nodding, going, "Yeah, it really ain't, right? You don't get a free cup of coffee in this town." But you get the opportunity to have visibility, to have real touch on policy, and you get noticed. If you bring the ideas. So in this case, people in the White House, and we're looking to put people on the board, you would bring a real strength. I was actually this group, believe it or not, was formed in 1984. So Frank Murkowski, it was the Arctic Policy Research Act and I think I have that right, in 1984, formed what is called the U.S. Arctic.
Frank Murkowski's
father.
Yeah,
yes,
right.
Part of the dynasty. This was a recognition at kind of the height of, or the depth of the Cold War, really, 1983, 84. These were very dark days of acknowledging how far behind the U.S. was, in particular, to the Soviet Union in all things Arctic, mm-hmm. and that we needed to really get a cross-cutting governmental effort, research-driven, to bring things up to snuff. So there's a commission think about it as the headwaters for Arctic policy within the government. And mm-hmm. so I was brought in to represent industry on that.
So what is the, I see very few people, I guess, talking about this. What is like the grand vision for American policy in the Arctic in general? Like how do you think about America's Arctic future?
Yeah. Hey, look, we want a safe Arctic. We want a free Arctic. We want an Arctic which improves the lives of the people who live there, but also helps the people live here, right? So there are, very few Americans that actually live above the Arctic Circle. I mean, it's several thousand, but as we know, 350 million live down here. So our view is, to have a safer Arctic, you got to have a collaborative Arctic. And part of that is having relations with Russia, like it or not. And this was where the irony of being, in the 40 plus years history of this commission, I was the first commissioner that ever spoke fluent Russian, if you can believe it. So I couldn't believe it when I got there. But there was so little emphasis on having a constructive dialogue with the Russians in areas that were really of import. So this was, I was serving under the Biden administration, and then the Trump appointees were summarily fired for this. But for my tenure there, there was a very strange dichotomy between wanting to advance, full bore on the climate agenda, but at the same time, an unwillingness to collaborate with Russia and emphasizing the risks of the Greenland ice sheet, of Arctic melting, of permafrost melting, of new transit corridors opening up like the Northern Sea Route, but still unwillingness to talk to Russia in any sort of constructive way. So this is this weird issue that Nick and I became friends because we were both obsessed with this issue. You two met each other because
this is the whole reason that we are friends, is because we had a conversation about this at a bar.
And so the main reason that the geopolitics of the Arctic are really salient and changing right now is, my understanding, because of these shipping lanes that are opening up.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
why this matters?
Sure. Again, like I hate to bring everything back to history, but like because I was a history major and a Russian major, I think it's important, right? And especially for policymakers, if you don't have the grounding in, I'm not an attorney, but I think it's helpful to understand the history. So one of the things that kind of, the realization here is with the Arctic ice retreating, that there is a very viable new shipping lane emerging across Russia. And you can trace this back to basically if we want to go back in history, we'll talk about the 1905 war, Russo-Japanese War, and Russia's humiliating defeat in it. And they realized that was because they were unable to supply their front on the Pacific. They didn't have cross-country railroad that worked well enough, and they had no way to move goods across the top of Russia because they didn't have icebreakers at that point. They were just developing them. And in this age of Arctic exploration, remember, nobody had gone to the North Pole, right? So this is where this kind of fusing of history comes in, which is we sent our own explorers, United States Naval explorer under command, sponsored privately, but discovered these islands that are today, if you think about them, they're basically like the Gibraltar of the future Northern Sea route. And so there's one called Wrangel Island. And I pointed out to people, like, this is a U.S. territory. We discovered it. We planted the U.S. ensign there. We actually occupied it, and our citizens were hauled off. If you remember the Hunt for Red October, some people have seen the movie. Actually, they were hauled off by a Soviet gunboat in 1924. So if you know your history, you know that there's a island called Wrangel Island that's 270 nautical miles off Cape Lisburne, Alaska. That's U.S. territory. It's about the size of Delaware and Rhode Island combined. All sorts of natural wonders there, resources, et cetera, but very important strategically. So we also share with Russia the 1,500 mile nautical boundary. It's the longest border in the world, nautical. So these are types of things which I think our policymakers don't have an understanding of or miss the salience of. And when you bring it back to Ukraine and the current conflicts with Russia, you realize that, hey, it does all tie back to Arctic energy, right? This was Putin's strength, was his ability to export energy and use that as leverage. So that gas that was flowing through Nord Stream 2 was coming out of the Arctic, Yamal. The Russians announced in 2020 that they were doing the largest investment in the history of that country in the Russian Arctic, $300 billion. That's a lot of money for Russia, right? Didn't even make a ripple of noise here, right? And you realize they're serious. They're going to get things done. People laughed at the names of Novatech in 2014 or something when the Russians said, we're going to do LNG up in the Arctic. It will never be, it's diseconomic, will never happen, et cetera. But at the same time, we don't do that in Alaska. Right? You look at, and we had great successes before. That's what was so frustrating. And to bring it back to policy, look at what helped break the back of inflation in the 1970s. Well, it was literally America's energy independence. It was our ability to put OPEC back in a box, and we did that by Alaskan oil. So at one point, we were up to 2 million barrels a day coming out of Alaska in the TAPS pipeline. Today we're 460,000. It's not because the oil's not there. It's that we've convinced ourselves we don't want to produce our own resources and we shouldn't do this.
Can you talk a little bit about the development politics of the Arctic? I try not to depress myself all that frequently, but you go to the Arctic Council website sometimes and it's like, it seems that, I'll only exaggerate a little bit, the overwhelming priority is little native tribes continuing to live exactly the way they have for the last 400 years. And any talk about developing any of the Arctic is verboten and,
Yes.
evil. And it's partially evil for climate and environment reasons, but also evil because how dare you? Only igloos can be on this land for the rest of time.
My favorite Arctic Council article is the one that they had about ensuring gender parity in climate change. That is that one kind of takes the cake a little bit.
Yeah, but talk to me just a little bit about like the question of developing the Arctic in general.
Yeah. A lot of the thinking is born down here with a complete misunderstanding of the realities on the ground. And it's done, frankly, by people who are not doers. And they don't realize just how difficult it is, how committed you need to be to make anything a success there. And the amount of planning and expense that's required to do anything, the smallest task, right? So like even in Arctic science, for every $1 that you could directly attribute to the actual research that's being done, there's probably 7 or 8 that's spent on the logistics of doing it, right? So things can be incredibly complex and difficult to execute up there. It makes sense, right? There's a fundamental misunderstanding about what drives the Arctic too, and that's capital flows too, right? So people are not, if there are people and they live an indigenous lifestyle as they have for hundreds or thousands of years, and that's perfectly fine. You support that and you want to help them to enjoy the life that they want to lead. 100%. Nobody's saying they shouldn't have that or they shouldn't be entitled to do that. But a number of them really do ascribe to have different, more modern lives, right? But there are judgments which are superimposed from down here on the types of lives that we think those people should have.
It's like that thing about the Vancouver Canadian community of Indians who the Vancouver decided to give them this giant piece of land, and instead of building teepees on it, they're building an extremely luxury apartment development. And everyone's like, no, not like that. It's like, yeah, it turns out that like people want to modernize.
Yeah. Modernity and progress.
Yeah.
And
you brought up Icebreakers a few minutes ago, and we should talk about that.
Sure.
Icebreaker gap. Is it real?
Oh, it's woefully bad.
We're talking about the mints,
it's
right?
woefully bad. Yes. So icebreakers, hey, look, this is a well-worn trope. Everybody, I think, who touches the Arctic gets frustrated. They dig into it, and it's seen as an unsolvable problem. But literally, to give you ideas, we have about what I call 1.5 functional icebreakers in this country that are government controlled or run. So one is 47 years old. That's our heavy icebreaker. One is 25 plus years old. That's our medium duty icebreaker. So the difference being the level of ice and capability that they have. But Russia, 50 plus, 60 plus nuclear, right? So everything is mission-based in the Arctic, right? These distances. In Greenland, there are no roads. In Siberia, frankly, there are no roads, right? In Yakutia, some of these people don't have an idea of the enormity of the Arctic up there and the difficulties to do things. But icebreakers are the enabling infrastructure for almost anything, right? Even in a military basis. And we don't have a capability to even show presence in much of the Arctic because of our lack of capability.
Yeah, doesn't China have more icebreakers than we do?
China has more icebreakers.
And they are a near Arctic power, which is a term they made up for reasons that have.
Yes,
I think at the closest point there, I think it's like 860 kilometers from the Arctic Circle.
And it's a longer discussion about what we've done to our own shipbuilding capacity here in the U.S. It's there's been some more recent attention on trying to bring this back. There are there are what could be viewed as legal impediments, but at the same time, there are national security abilities to waive their waivers for this. So we could, basically part of the limitations on having more icebreakers are that the hulls need to be built in the United States, which we don't have the capacity to do, or the shipyards that can do it are focused on projects for the Navy and much larger serial shipbuilding capacity. So consequently, we're dying on the vine. We're having to cut things from whole cloth in terms of recreating abilities which have been lost, right? Versus go to Finland, go to the logical places, go to Romania. They built very good icebreakers, right? Places where you could get this to bridge the gap. And that's the kind of thinking that we're hoping to inculcate in the next admin, which is like, hey, we've got to deal with the practical exigencies of where we are at this moment in time.
Talk to us a little bit about what needs to happen next time. At Treasury on the Arctic issue, what are some of the, couple of things that you're trying to harp on and really bring front and center in terms of priorities and things that should be done?
Yeah. Well, we would like to settle down the world to allow the U.S. to focus inwardly, and grow stronger, and then help make the world a safer place. I think that's a big picture, right? So it's beginning to dial back on extraneous things and prioritize things. So like, as I mentioned, when I left the administration, I went back to farming pecans for a little while, kind of the Cincinnati deal. I literally went back to Eagle Pass, or 20 miles south there on the river. And you see that front and center, the crisis that we have there you're living in. I mean, this is, it's hard if you're not seeing it in day to day to really appreciate the magnitude of what's going on down there and the need to focus on stopping it. Plus, this, bigger picture at Treasury, the spending. It's got to stop. People need to understand that, $1 trillion of new debt every 100 days is just an impossible situation. We've got to roll that debt over probably a third of it each year, and we're resetting at 2x the carrying cost, right? Interest rates only, we're still not tackling inflation, so it's going to get worse before it gets better on that macro side. But even before you get into discretionary spending, we're still, our tax revenues and receipts are not enough to cover our must pays. So there's got to be some reality superimposed. This modern monetary theory way of thinking has got to be excised and banished to some very dark corner of economic policy making, and we need to we need to have some serious discussions, on what is our focus. And so, money is $60 billion is a lot, right? 60 billion can rebuild. 61 billion, can do a lot of good in our own country. Frankly, it's needed here. So.
Talk to us a little bit about, to tie it up in a bow, what you think that the Greenland Arctic issue should be resurfaced, and how. I know that there was some frustration last time around that the messaging didn't come out in the right way about buying and things like that. What do you think the actual medium term plan when it comes to Greenland should look like?
It needs to be something that takes into consideration what the Greenlanders want to do, right? That they're the captains of their own destiny, and the Kingdom of Denmark is an important partner, right? And for the U.S., so we have to figure out where our common interests align on this. The U.S. is basically the security guarantor for Greenland, and we have been, and but we have to realize that. This may not always be the case, right? I mean, if you look at the other groups in this world, a la China, who would like to be more active there, who will be more active there, it is not a guarantee that we are always in this happy stasis that we might be here. So we need to focus on our common interests here and work to align them. And there's economic ways to do that. There's strategic ways to do that. So, that's how I would lead it. I would build on that basis.
For our members only section, I'm going to ask Tom about what he's terrified or thinking about that no one else is paying attention to right now. Sort of our go-to standard question for the bonus section, as well as the case for pecans only from a certain part of the country. I want to hear a little bit more about the pecan farming. For those of you who don't know, our membership program is something on YouTube where you can become either a truther or a statesman. You get the episodes 24 hours early, you get special flair on the YouTube channel, and you get these bonus segments that are just for our subscribers. It really helps us keep this podcast going. You know, that donor money we're raising should be going towards other stuff. This podcast is extraordinarily valuable, so we're asking you guys to help chip in and support it. So you can go to YouTube and you can also see our beautiful mugs. I mean, mostly these two. I look like an ugly weirdo today. So once again, that's our membership program, Truthers and Statesmen. Go to YouTube now. All right, Tom. If you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out. Tom, how can people keep up with everything that you're saying and doing and reach out to you if they are so inclined?
Sure. No, happy to visit with anybody. I'm not really super active on social media, but I'm on Twitter at Tom Dan's CFA, at Tom Dan CFA, and LinkedIn, and also at the Heritage Foundation. So I'm a visiting fellow there in the Allison Center for National Security. So.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for everything, for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun. And, obviously you cannot comment on such a thing, but I really hope President Trump chooses to give you as high a post as possible so that you can continue to do great stuff next time.
That's very kind and it'd be an honor. Thank you both. Really enjoyed our time today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Moment of Truth. We're very amazed that so many of you have listened to this show for so long, and we endeavor to keep going, to keep producing content without recycling past guests. Like Saurabh said, we have this new membership program that you can join on YouTube. You can be a truther or a statesman. Both are very cool, though I think truther is kind of the funnier name. So please feel free to join that and get some of the bonus content, get access to episodes early. We're paying attention to who is signing up early, and we might have some cool rewards for you in the future. As always, please subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already. If this is your first time listening, please feel free to give us a review. I'm saying feel free, but really I'm begging. Please give us a 5-star review. It's great. It really helps to get the message out there. Thank you so much for tuning in for another great episode of Moment of Truth, and we will see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.